I've always had a soft spot for the transaxle Porsches, and that's why I bought the 924. But also, I've always had an eye for the Porsche 928. So, how good is it? Let's get into it. It's another Witty 924. Hi everyone, welcome back to the show, and thanks again as always for joining. Today's episode is going to be slightly different. We have another guest to the show, which I have been promising for quite some time. He has been on the show before, and we spoke, I think, probably a year or two ago, where we got into some of his history of cars, and that's our good friend Nige. He has a fantastic history of cars, very similar to Max, who was on the last show. But I've invited Nige back because, like me, we've always had a bit of a soft spot for the transaxle Porsches, but his flavour has been the big brother to the 924, and that is the 928. And he's had one now for about a year in terms of ownership, and I thought it would be great to have him on the show to really get under the hood, no pun intended, on how 928 ownership really feels like, from the look, the feel, the driving, the maintenance, and all of those good things that, you know, you want to know about if you are thinking or considering a type of car such as a 20, 30, 40-year-old car like Porsche in the transaxle range. So I brought him to the show, and let's get into the conversation. So welcome, Nige, and it's lovely to have you back on the show. I know it's been a number of months since we last spoke, but I wanted to get you back on the show because you are now a proud owner of a Porsche 928.
I am. I have realized almost a lifelong ambition. As you know, as long as you and I have known each other, I think I've always talked to you about wanting to own one.
Yeah.
And kind of waiting for the right moment and opportunity to come up when I could. And that presented itself just over a year ago. Yeah. So I'm now 13 months into 928 ownership, of the car that's 30 years old this December. So yeah, let's talk about it, right? Because it's for me it's a dream fulfilled. It's an unusual choice, but let's get into it, right? But I now have joined the Porsche.
Yes, you're in the stable.
I'm in the stable.
You're in the stable. So, just for everyone listening, what is the model that you decided upon within the 928 range?
So I went with the 1993 928 GTS.
Yep.
Which is technically the last of the line. I think they finished producing them literally sort of 6 to 8 months after mine was manufactured. So to me, it was the pinnacle. It was the most advanced version of the 928. It had the most advanced drivetrain and the best engine. Yeah. And of course, it had to keep up with the then change in modern standards in terms of fitting cat converters and some of the stuff they did on the interior. So yeah, a December 93 928 GTS.
And color?
Guards red.
Okay.
With a cream interior with red piping on the leather. And
very nice.
You and I discussed it's the one color I didn't want. But what sold it to me was the interior, because a lot of the darker colors, and you're very much at the beck and choose of what's for sale, right? You can't spec these things. So a lot of the cars I was seeing had black interiors, and they're, to me, not the most exciting place to be. But this, with a sort of a cream leather interior, with a red and with the red paint finish, it's actually a really good combination. So not my first choice, but now that I own it, and a lot of people have commented that it is a classic Porsche color. The guy who originally spec'd it, did a very nice job. So yes, that's me. Guards red with cream leather.
Yeah, and I think when you look at the ebbs and flows of colors through the decades, you get the sort of, I think the 80s predominantly and early 90s, that there was a dream-filled wish for red and white, and these cars were to a penny. And if you go into like the noughties, even sort of in the last decade, you tend to see a sea of very dark colors.
Yeah,
I mean, some manufacturers won't even offer you a bright color,
right?
And I'm sure there's method in the madness in some respects. I know that many have, specialist departments that, if you want that type of color, sir, that will cost you an extra, X, Y, Z. So suddenly,
Absolutely.
there's an extra revenue line. But so I think Guards Red, you're right, is a classic. I don't think it will ever go out of sync in terms of the brand itself. Being Guards Red to Porsche, it's the poster child and so on.
100%.
But the color, the interesting thing is the interior color, because I think when you and obviously I'll let you talk to this a bit more, but from my experience of sort of sitting in the 928, firstly it's low. You're in very much a capsule.
Absolutely.
And I think you want the sort of airiness of a light interior to help not just with the visibility of what's going on, but you get to see lots of really cool things in the car that you might not see when it's a dark interior. The switches and stuff.
Yeah, and I think the interior of 928. Okay, the dashboard is iconic, right? The fact that it pivots with the steering wheel, those sort of controls for turning the lights and the hazard flashes. I mean, they look like the things you'd use to trigger a nuclear bomb, right? And when you use them, they're super solid. But the actual center console itself is pretty bland, right? There's not an awful lot going on in there. And in fact, it's almost a little disappointing, right? So I agree with you. Yeah. What you want around you is something that actually sort of counters that in a strange way, in that, it's a tremendously nice place to be. And this car is 30 years old this December. I think the rear seats have probably never been sat in.
Wow.
So they are absolutely immaculate, as is the passenger seat, actually. The driver's seat, as you can imagine, on a car of that age, needs some attention. I'm not going to deny that. But it does lighten the interior. All those cars had sunroofs. They don't tilt, they slide.
Yeah.
The roof line is low. So when you get in the back, if you're brave enough, you're hunched, right? There's no comfortable way to be. So that lighter interior combined with what I think is quite a dull center console, it actually helps offset it, because some of the ones I sat in that were black, they're not the happiest places to be, right? No. Because you're right, you do miss detail. And when it's just that monotone slab of color around you, it doesn't necessarily make you feel special, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Again, you're right. When you get into it, my son has a sort of a 2018 Mini, and you were with us this year. We drove to Le Mans. We pulled up at a set of traffic lights, and I remember looking at this Mini, and I was looking up, and I was thinking, I'm looking up at a Mini, because you're that low down. It's only when you have that sort of comparison with a modern car, you go, crikey me, this. I really am quite low to the ground here.
Yeah,
right. It makes it super easy to clean.
Well, in absolutely, and I think that little bit just on the sort of rear interior seats, because this is one of those. I think when you think about how cars were developed, and certainly the 911, and I want to say, and someone will keep me true on this, I'm sure, in the visitors and audience on this, but there is I believe a view that if you made a car that was a 2+2,
yes,
it helped with insurance purposes and so
Correct.
on. And as much as the 911 has rear seats, it's well documented that the rear seats for most one are for children, very small children, if that. And I guess the 928 followed a similar suit.
Exactly.
In that they look really cool, but you probably don't need to have very big legs or very short. Yeah.
So I mean, they're sculpted. For those of you sort of listening to this who are old enough to remember the very 70s style that those seats represented, right? And if you look at comparable Lamborghinis, particularly from that era, there was a flamboyance around the way in which they were designed. So these seats they look like seats, but they're sculpted, right? They have an absolute shape and form to them. And I agree with you, right? If you think about the back of that car, there is a huge central rear glove box, right? Which if you open up, you can balance a couple of drinks in. Right?
You haven't tried.
But also, because of the way the roof line goes down, and because of where the glass for the rear rear tailgate comes in, they actually put two sun visors in the back that you can flip behind your head, so that if the sun is coming down through the glass and you're sitting in the back, you can actually you've got two personal sun visors which protect your head against the the heat of what would have been the sun. So I take your point about it being, if you're 5 and under, you can probably sit in there, but it wasn't done as a token gesture. Why would you put sun visors in? Why would you create a rear center console that's lockable? So people in the back could store trinkets, various and bits and pieces. And I find that my daughter has ridden in the back, not for far, and she's 19, so she's had the experience, and it's just no place that you would choose to be. No two ways about it. The passenger seat as far forward as you can make it. And it's because of the sculptured nature of those seats and the way it almost forces you to sit. It's you'd need to take the front seat out to make it a comfortable experience.
And does the roof line sort of touch the head? I can't remember how it comes right low, doesn't it? Yeah.
There's not that much of a gap between the top of the headrest and where the roof lining is. But as I said, the fact that they fitted rear sun visors, again suggests that it might have been a marketing tick in the box in terms of the, what it would, a 2+2. So, it's a 4-door, it's a 4-person car, sir. Therefore, it can't be a 2-seater coupe, which might have sat into a different insurance bracket. I can't think what that was, but they took it seriously. They took it seriously.
It's quite interesting. It must be like on the production line of a 928 having 4 sun visors to fit. I'm sure it's a sports car. No, it's a GT. It's having 4 sun visors. Yeah, I mean, and I think one of the standout design features, and you and I have spoken about this, as as I've got closer to the 928 and appreciated much more about what it is since you've owned yours, is the curvature at the back, and not just the wheel arches in the rear, but the way the windows. And it's hard to explain, isn't it, how those back quarter windows shape both down and to the side. It's almost like 3-way concave glass,
but it's curved glass.
Yeah.
Right. And you pointed it out to me, and I don't remember thinking that much about it at the time, but now you look at every other car. No other car that I can think of, other than maybe a 70s Lamborghini or a 70s Ferrari, has curved glass. All the panes are straight, right?
Yeah.
We understand why. It's simpler to make. It's simpler to fit. Now, the rear quarters on a 928 don't open, so it's purely visual.
Yeah.
And, but as you run your hand over it, it is definitely curved, right? No two ways about it. And the other thing that strikes you about it when you compare it to a modern car is how simple the lines are. There aren't creases. There aren't folds. There are. It's just a single sheet of metal that's been bent in a certain way to create that shape. And as a kid growing up, we always used to call them a shark, because the Series ones, if a shark had wheels, that's what it would look like.
Yeah.
And I think the Series 4 and the GTSs beyond it, yes, they got a little bit fatter, and I don't deny that. But the purity of the shape is still there, and particularly when you compare it to a modern car, you look at a modern Lexus or a modern Hyundai, and they're almost like pieces of origami at times. The simplicity and the sheet metal is gone, but in a 928, you keep that simplicity in the sheet metal.
Yeah, and I was surprised. I mean, for most people who follow the Porsche brand, I think there's an agreement that Porsche, like many brands, have put on weight over the years. And the 911, when you look at the original 912 and then 911 and through the family and iterations of the 911 to what we have today, there's a vast difference in width.
Yeah.
And what surprised me, and again, this was from me following your car for the best part of nearly 1,000 miles down to Le Mans, is just actually how wide it is for the time, based on the fact it was built in the 80s, 90s, just how wide the car was.
Well, it was designed in the 70s.
Of course, yeah.
So, this car came out in 77. I think it was European Car of the Year in 78.
Yeah.
I had it on my bedroom wall. I had a brown one, and I forget which magazine it was. Perhaps your listeners have got it. There was a cutout. The car was half cut away. So it had the Pasha interior, it had a brown, it was the brown paint color, but it was a Series 1. Now, I think if you were to part them nose to nose, the later model's definitely wider at the rear. And, I guess what you'd call a standard size English garage, and I have a single garage door that I drive it in, it literally just fits. The only other car I've owned which was that type was the Maserati. I had a Ghibli for a while. but everything else just sort of glides in and out of that garage. But this thing is, you hold your breath, right? You have to get that lined up exactly right. Now, I get getting fatter for safety regulations, changes in bumper design or changes in car design that, that make it safer for both the passenger and the road user. And I think for the Series 1 probably didn't have an airbag. It probably didn't have a cat. Both of those modifications had to be brought in because of where Porsche was selling them. And so, I think if I were to jump into a Series 1, yes, it's still very recognizably a 928, but it would be different. I actually think it would feel different.
Yeah, indeed. So we've discussed a lot about the sort of interior, the styling. I'd like to get a little bit into the sort of the driving experience. You've owned the car for sort of 13 months now. And for those out there who are, wowed by what we've just talked about, the styling, the look, how different it is, that can all change, obviously, as soon as you sit behind the seat and you start the engine and you put your hands on the wheel and you think, oh, this isn't what I thought, as so many people do when they, drive cars. And they do say sometimes never, meet your childhood dream or your heroes and stuff. How was it for you? So, you had the poster. It potentially is a hero of yours.
Yeah.
When you jumped in, you started that engine. Just talk a little bit about how you felt when that, 5.7 liter.
Well, it's 5.4, but it's
5.4. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I think that. So, if I recall, and it's still true today, when you start it up, the thing that strikes you about it is how quiet it is. Yeah. Right, as a true Grand Tourer, this thing was never going to have an exhaust burble like you'd hear in a classic American V8 or cars like that, right? So the quietness is the first thing that strikes you, right? And I'll be honest, it's a little disappointing. I'd like it to be a little bit noisier. When you drive it, the second thing that strikes you is the weight, because this is not, there's nothing subtle about this car. Right, yeah. The power steering has to work pretty hard to help you steer this thing, right? Yeah. So it's the weight of the car, not so much the bulk. It actually doesn't feel like a big car to drive, but compared to I run an M140 as my daily driver, and I think when I drove your 924, I got back into it, and everything felt like a toy. The steering was light, the accelerator was light. It just felt like it was very, very different, almost. Antiseptic, actually.
Yeah.
So you jump out of a 928 into anything else, and it just feels super, super light.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the two things that strike you. One, you'd like a little bit more noise out of the engine, and two, it's just the weight of it. Right.
Yeah.
Now, when she gets moving, it's a lazy V8 mated to a quite lazy gearbox. Mine's an automatic.
Yeah.
And you really have to mash the carpet with the accelerator to actually wake it up and make it do something. Now, when it does, it's a force of nature, right? It's 350 brake horsepower. It takes a little while, sort of beyond sort of 3,000-ish revs. All of a sudden, this thing just takes on a life of its own. And it is, by modern day standards, quick. It pulls like a train to the red line. And if you use the manual selection and the automatic gearbox and you move up to the gears, it's not long before you're comfortably exceeding three figures.
Yeah.
The car feels solid. It feels planted. There's absolutely no fuss and no drama. And again, I think that's the other thing about Grand Tourers is, you could hop in this thing tomorrow and drive down to Nice, get out at the casino and feel as fresh as a daisy, right? Because that's what these things were designed to do. And that it pulls that off effortlessly. So not as noisy as I like. Certainly heavy. You have to want to drive this thing, but when you use the manual elements of the gearbox, particularly, and you let that V8 go, it's this is 113,000 miles.
Yeah,
it's been regularly serviced. The guys over at Northway Porsche, who you put me in touch with, gave it a very clean bill of health in the April and May of this year before we took it to Le Mans. Now you don't drive at 120 mile an hour all day every day, but if you want to get into those sort of speeds, the car is capable of doing it still.
Yeah.
And as long as you maintain the mechanics on these things, I think it'll do it in 100,000 miles time, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I've been absolutely blown away by the quality and the depth of the engineering, because I've owned a few Italian cars where that wouldn't be true, but in this instance, and I think for me, it's having confidence in a car.
Yeah.
could I jump at it tomorrow and do a long trip at it? I would have no hesitation about that. I wouldn't even think twice about it being a problem. And there's not many cars I've owned where I would always say that was true. So in that regard, I completely respect it. You know what? And you potter about in this thing, you'll get nearly 30 to the gallon. You drive it at 60 or 70 miles an hour, you'll get 30 to the gallon. And again, for a car that's that old with an engine that's that big, I take my hat off, man. That's impressive stuff.
And again, I hear the confidence in your conviction. And again, I was there watching it for 1,000 miles, not miss a beat. And
100%.
It is pretty impressive when you think that you can jump in something that's over 30 years old and have the confidence that, one, you're going to get there, but you're going to get there in comfort, in style, with relative enjoyment of what it is to do that sort of 1,000 miles. And to think that the 928 can just do that, I would argue there's probably not too many 911 owners of 30 years old who would say similar things. Probably maybe a bit controversial.
But there's a fragility to every car, right? And the Series 1 928s had it. They started out as 4.5 and 4.7 liter V8, so they were probably a little bit underpowered versus where they ended up. But I don't think you read or hear that much about stories of disasters in the 928s, right? In terms of they didn't do a bad model, or they didn't do a bad iteration, or they didn't do something to sort of mess it up. Because I think you're right, and you talked about this at the beginning, as they looked at front engine, transaxle versus rear engine, and the heritage of the company up until that point. It was a leap of faith for them. There was no proof point that said we've built one of these before and it kind of went well, so let's do it again, right? In the 922, the 924s and the 944s, which were of a similar sort of vintage and era, okay, the engine size might have been as big, but the principle was the same. We're going to stick a block up front. We're going to drive the rear wheels to a transmission of your choice. We'll turbocharge some. We won't turbocharge others.
Yeah.
But and you need to hold me honest in this. It's the first time I think Porsche would put a V8 in a car, first of all, and secondly, certainly at the front.
Yeah, I think we will definitely get corrected if.
I'm expecting the chat window to go live, right? But
I think I find that whole era of sort of Porsche fascinating. Anyway, the fact that there was this almost juggling act of, do we go like all other manufacturers and have engines at the front, drive rear wheels, versus this thing we've been battling with of a rear engined car that we've got to over engineer the suspension and balance things and try and make this thing work in a way that should work like a conventional car with a conventional engine up front and so on. And it's interesting, we all know how that story went.
Yes.
But equally, you sit here today and they coexist together in that company. So Porsche coexist front engines with rear engines, and it's interesting why they felt they couldn't do that more back then, because there was always this front versus back all the time. But I think we got because my 924 is the 70s as well, so they were all sort of in that era, and they all got through to the late 80s, early 90s, because it was the 968, which was the last iteration of sort of where the 924 started. And I don't know, there's a sort of a passion and love I have for the transaxle years of Porsche, and there's something really quite intuitive about how those cars drive. And I would encourage anyone who's out there to get behind the wheel, and like you say, before you bought the 928, I said you should have a go in the 924, because it's so raw. There is no driver aids of any sort, as you know.
And you forget right? You and I grew up driving cars of that era. No
Yeah.
power steering, not necessarily power brakes. Some with drum brakes.
Yeah.
And you have to, after you've been in a modern cars for so long with brilliant automatic gearboxes that are 100% reliable, you get back into a car like the 924, and I walked out that experience with a big grin on my face because it reminded me of what it was to drive a car. You have to think about how you enter a bend. You have to think about the gear you're in. You have to think about the weight you're going to have to apply into the steering. Do I go wide? Do I go narrow? Is this the right gear for the thing we're about to tackle? In a modern car, it's kind of, well, I might even have one hand on the wheel and I'll just accelerate where the accelerator is. Now, that could be laziness on my part, and I accept that. But in a 924, that experience I had, you couldn't get away with it.
Yeah.
You had to want to drive it. You had to focus. You had to concentrate. And at the end of the 20 odd miles I drove it for, I got out and I said I jumped into my 1 Series. Is like it's a toy. It's so light. There's that sensation had gone away. And there's maybe a group of people listening to this who've never had that experience.
Yeah.
Because they've always grown up with modern cars, with modern assisted steering, modern assisted brakes. But you don't have to wind the clock back too far to find that those were optional extras that people paid money for, right?
They did.
I'm surprised the 928 has rear seat belts, and that was probably a Californian law thing as opposed to anything else, right? But
yeah.
Anyway, I don't want to digress too much. It was the fact that you come alive in a car like that because it actually reminds you what it is to drive, and and you are in total and utter control. There's no electronic system that's going to compensate for an error that you make. You have to get it right, and if you don't get it right, you could end up sideways somewhere. So the 928 isn't that, because you can't provoke the 928 in the way that you could provoke the 924, right? Because that V8 doesn't really come alive until north of $3,000, and by then you're doing some quite silly speeds.
Yeah.
So it's different in the experience again. But I think the thing that strikes about the 928 is, again, silly observation, but it's so easy to park because you can see every corner of the car.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think if I parked it next to your 911, they're almost identical length.
Yeah.
So you think it's this big, wide car. In reality, it's the same sort of size and scale as a 911. And when you're reversing and you look over your left shoulder, you can see every corner. I don't need a sensor or a warning light. I can see what I'm doing, right? And again, you become anesthetized to a modern car that will warn you, or that you've got cameras, this, that, and the other. In these cars, you don't have that, right? It's just you and the machine and your ability to, control it on the throttle, etc. So, I think, again, for listeners who've been around the same sort of vintages that we have and have remembered what driving those cars were like, it's just phenomenal to get back into one. And it's a real privilege to own a car that can still do that, right? Yeah. It's something it's something I don't take for granted, put it that way.
So what's on the cards for the car, Nige? You spoke about some of the bits that you thought, I'd like a bit more noise, or I'd like a little bit more feel. Is there any sort of things that you're eyeing up as potential upgrades?
Yeah, so I think the big one is the suspension, right?
Yeah.
Before I bought it, the car sat in the garage for 2 years. It was taken out to pass an MOT and put back in the garage again. So you and I have discussed this. I'm not sure it's the dampers that are a problem. I think the springs are probably where the problem is. It sailed through an MOT, so I'm not suspecting there's any issue with bushes or with leaking shocks. Yeah. So I think it's the springs, I think that needs to work on. So that would be the big piece of work for next year.
Yeah.
On a 928, for those of you listening who've never looked at them, electrics are the nightmare. So if you're looking to buy one, when you do the purchase, make sure the sunroof opens, the lights pop up, the windows go down, the lights come on, because and you've seen that under the bonnet of a 928, right? It is a nightmare. To do anything simple requires taking half the engine apart. So it's and I don't mean that in a trivial way. So the electrics on mine, all the big stuff works, but there's annoying things with dashboard lights and with interior lights that need fixing, and maybe you and I can do that. But the major thing really is the suspension. There is a performance exhaust you can get for them, and I really have this Jekyll and Hyde. Do I keep the car original, or do I actually go put something on it that makes it slightly more enjoyable, with a view that you put the original exhaust back on when you came to get rid of it? I'm still sort of wrestling with that. And there was an episode of Harry's Garage where he drives a Series 1 manual that has had a performance exhaust on it, and both he and the owner comment that it just brings that engine alive a little bit more. So
Yeah.
so the really big work that I need to do is the suspension, but the nice to have would be a performance exhaust, I think.
Yeah, and I think most Porsche owners would tend to go the route of suspension as well.
Yeah.
I think we all enjoy the more, feel and better handling as you drive these types of cars, and they're sort of, built and set up for that type of engagement, aren't they, as a driver's car? So I highly recommend suspension. I know we had a quick look at,
Yes.
there's a vast amount of kits there for 928.
Oh, good grief, yes.
Yeah, which is fantastic.
Yes.
And I definitely agree with you. I think the view of an exhaust that you can add and take off if needed, I mean, it's actually quite a nice sales addition if you do ever move the car on, to say, look, to a future owner, you've got the original and you've got this nice sounding exhaust. I think it's a really nice thing. There's quite a lot of discussion about people in the UK with their cars versus, say, the US, because the US are very much open to modification, and it doesn't tend to hinder too much the resale value of the car, as long as it's tasteful modifications and modifications that are done well, and people have an appreciation for them. Where in the UK we tend to be a bit more, I don't know, reserved on stuff like that. We're like, oh, you've tweaked what, and you've touched what. And I think it's okay with some of the classics if you have the ability to add more modern touches now. So retro or resto mods.
Yeah, resto mods.
Is a massive thing, and you think about how much they charge for that now.
Oh,
I mean, astronomical amounts of money. But I think tasteful, upgrades using today's technology can do wonders for these types of classics, can't they?
Yeah, I see that. I definitely see the point. I think it's more the thing in me, right? What I've been handed is an original. The previous owners have chosen not to do anything to it. I respect the original engineering teams that built it. They built it to the best of their ability with the best of the equipment they had at the time, right? And there's something about me that says I like that, right? Yeah. Now I agree. If I look at the hi-fi system in it, it's still there. You take AirPods with you everywhere you go. Let me put it that way. And I think you can now buy these retro Blaupunkt units, that look like what would originally have been fitted to the car, but with a speaker system that's much up to much more modern standards. So I have to be a little bit hypocritical in that I certainly would upgrade the hi-fi in it, but I would put a retro unit in, with modern Bluetooth streaming, modern audio, so you can connect a phone to it and do a lot of things that you now take for granted in a modern car, because I don't think the communication side of it should be in any way compromised, right? So yeah, I think on that, but I wouldn't go put an Apple CarPlay system in, because that would just be so incongruous in a car like that. That would be to me, a resto mod too far. But a Blaupunkt Bremen or a Berlin, or one of those units that have the original red LCD display, that have the buttons that pop out, that look like they were originally designed to go in those cars, but with some modern touches. I 100% agree with you. And it would improve the audio experience, which is currently somewhat non-existent.
Yeah, no, I feel and hear that, because I've gone through the same sort of trials and tribulations with my car and the 924. So finding something that is period correct,
yes,
some sort of modern flavor to it is a good thing. And there's a couple out there. I managed to find something that was a bit more sort of retro, because the original Blaupunkts and stuff are just crazy money.
Oh yeah.
I don't have many cassette players left, or tapes I can use in the car. So I just thought, I'm not going to go for that. I'll just go for something that's a bit more retro, that I can use a bit of Bluetooth and
stuff. So this one has a JVC unit in a head unit, which has a CD player. And I, like you, I don't have CDs anymore. I found two. So I popped one in and it doesn't play. So even though you've got but driving back through France, because I think the French take FM radio a lot more seriously, I tried the FM tuner, and the thing sprang to life. All of a sudden, music and sound was coming out, and I was thinking, oh my God, this thing genuinely does work. But I think you've got a combination of dry joints, broken speakers, so turning it to any sensible volume was just beyond annoying. So I ended up turning it off. And I've on the passenger seat in a 928, to the left of the passenger seat, there's a piece of carpet that has 2 screws over it. If you take those screws off, inside there is the amplifier. So they ran a cable out of the center console, and there's these dirty, very thick cables that run underneath the carpet, and they end up in this amplifier. Now, these use 5-pin DIN plugs.
Wow.
Right? You'll know what one of those is.
Yeah.
There are 4 of them, right? And they used to be a nightmare when I was growing up with them, right? The dry joints, they'd solder, they would break inside. So I decided I wouldn't touch it. I actually genuinely left it alone and put the cover back on. I went to Northway and talked to a guy there who recommended a company called Kleiss Audio based out of Marlow.
Yeah.
I spoke to them and said, look, I've got an original amp here. Is this of any value to anyone? And they just turned around and said, well, no, not really. that kind of sums it up, really. There's no aftermarket for 30-year-olds audio tech, right? It's just for the museum piece and nothing else.
It's interesting you say about sort of the pins used or the connectors, because one of the big things I find, and actually a lot of the community around sort of these transactors that I talk to, certainly in the 924 circles, is that we all experience sort of gremlins around electrical connections and things not working the way potentially they should, even though everything looks like it's connected right and everything is aligned. And what it tends to boil down to is that you just need to scrub all the connections.
Right.
And so under a 924 dash, you literally look under, and there's like this spaghetti western of little spade connectors that just clip in to what looks like a hockey puck, is the only way I can describe it, with little connectors that these spades all connect on. And over 30, 40 years, you get this sort of oxidized white.
Well, it's salt. It's quite often a buildup of salt. If it's copper, it'll be a reaction that it's almost like copper sulfate as it reacts with the air.
That's
and
it.
If you get WD-40, and I've done this many times, soak one of those components in WD-40 for, even 20, 30 minutes, and then just use a soft lint cloth to clean it off afterwards. It comes up looking like new.
Exactly. Yeah. So you spend a lot of time chasing gremlins, which tend to be just really those bad connections over time. Built these sort of layers of oxidization, as you say.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a day's work. It's boring and tedious, but once you do it, you'll be amazed how your car suddenly becomes a bit more lively.
Yeah, the sunroof on this one, it mostly closes. And then it stops. So you reset the switch and it closes, and then it closes. But those last sort of 10 centimeters, it sounds like it's really hard work. And I take your point that if I actually went in and looked at how the motor was driven, a simple cleanup would do it. It could be the switch end or it could be the motor end, right? But and again, if you look at the switches in the car, they're faded now. The paint's coming off them, so you need to replace them. So these are little detail things, but. My car was at Brooklands for the 40th year anniversary of the 928.
Nice.
And it's not concourse by any stretch, but it came second overall. And as part of the history of the car that I had when I acquired it, there was a picture of in the Porsche magazine. The cars were lined up on the old banked circuit at Brooklands, which still exists, right? Yeah. Because it's Mercedes-Benz world now, so you can actually still walk the circuit. And in fact, if you're 1.5 meters and above, you can actually drive on the circuit because they have a driving place there. Yeah. But yeah, they had these cars lined, they had them banked up on the circuit, and my red 928 was a little arrow pointed to it, and it came second overall. And of course, the winner was Copenhagen Blue, which is the color that I really, really wanted, and which I know you have on your 924.
Yeah, and it's a really unusual color, isn't it? And like you say, in a sea of whites and reds and those types of colors, the blues played sort of second fiddle a lot of the time back then. So it's quite unusual to find, a nice Copenhagen.
Yeah, and it's quite a striking color, right? And I like you at the 928's what I call a friendly car. People wave at it, they smile at you. In forecourts, they come over and talk to you, right? Because those people that know what it is will come and talk to you about it, and people who don't know what it is will come, what is it? Right? I had the pleasure of being invited to Aston Martin 3 or 4 Sundays ago. We stopped at a service station in Banbury. And before I even got out the car, I had a father and son walking up towards it, and the little lad was pointing because he'd never seen one.
Yeah.
Right. So, and I'm not precious about this. I let him sit in the driver's seat. We turned it on. He had a little look, right? Because I think these things should be shared, right? Yeah. But you do get that, and you probably get the same with yours, right? People genuinely stop and look, and it being red, and particularly that type of red, it does stand out. There's no two ways about it. But I said it's a friendly car. People, don't give you the wrong gestures or whatever it is. They genuinely look at it as a historical item in a way. And I've owned it for 13, 14 months. I swear to God, in the miles I've traveled up and down this country, I've never seen another one. So I'm sure they're out there somewhere. I just have never seen another one.
Yeah, I think, like I say, sometimes they're just fine weather cars, and
yes,
we don't get too much fine weather, as they say in the UK. And like you say, others could be as yours was before, where someone will just go out, MOT it, and then put it back in the garage.
Yeah.
So it's a shame, because these cars are an amazing sight when they're out on the roads, and they are fantastic to drive. And the 924 for me is of a similar sort of ilk, that I don't see any, unless you're going to sort of car meets, or a purpose built for these types of cars to go and travel to. You just don't see any of them. So when I go around in mine, and of course the old age joke with the 924 is, it was a VW project initially before it became Porsche. People will sort of have the rib and say, "Oh, is it really a Porsche?" Well, it's got the badge and it's got it written on the car, so it's Porsche, but actually, I think there's an appreciation for these cars that have definitely spawned a new sort of revival. Certainly through my ownership, I've had the car probably 6-7 years now, and I've definitely seen much more appreciation for the transaxles in whole, in entirety, and even some of the resto mod companies are starting to look. There's a fabulous 928 resto that's been done, and I forget the name, but it's all over Instagram, and it's been done in the sort of famous it's like a goldy brown color. It's absolutely amazing. I forget the name, but an amazing bit of engineering that's gone into that. And the transaxles never really had that type of warmth or love around them, but now they're getting it. The 944s, the 968s, they're all starting to get to a value now where people are saying, "Oh, actually, they're of a value that I'm happy to put money into them. I'm happy to maybe, build something that's a bit more, future-proofed, be it a resto mod and so on." So it's I'm just waiting for that to happen to the 924.
Well, and I think people forget that was born out of an oil shock.
I know. Yes.
When the oil crisis hit, running around in 911s and the configurations that they had, if Porsche were at times going to survive, they had to do something differently, right? And so 2-liter sort of inline fours in a relatively, again, simple body design, where you could raid the parts bin of other manufacturers for door handles and switchgear just to reduce the cost of building it, right? People forget the history associated with it. It flies in the face that the 928 was always born as a V8. It was never born as anything else, right? But Porsche always had that cachet that they could get away with an area of the market where people would spend what you could buy a 4-bedroom detached house for something that had 4 wheels, right? And, but at the time, and people argue today about the SUVs that they design and develop. They do it because the company is then allowed to go and do the more interesting projects that keeps that company in actually a very healthy state. But you have to remember the history of the time, and it's not as it wasn't a straightforward path. And I'm sure the purists would never have really wanted to have done it. But when an oil shock hits like it did in the mid-70s, it was spin the dice time, because you might not have been around in the early 80s.
Indeed, and I'm we look with fond memories now back, the fact that these things exist because of it, and I'm thankful for that, because I've had several years of crazy fun, not just driving it, but actually swearing at it and trying to put it together as these things need lots of tender care.
You just don't turn the key and start them.
Yeah.
right? In mine, I'm going to contradict myself slightly here. The 928, the thing I've learned is it does actually go through oil. So if you were going to do the London to Nice run, you'd need to take a litre of oil with you, right? And when I first started to see the oil pressure warning light come on, my concern was, oh my God, is this a problem? But then you read the documentation, and let's face it, Porsche documentation is pretty thorough. It talks about the consumption rates in this car, and I'd never experienced it. Even on the run to Le Mans, I never had an issue.
Yeah.
Now, as you know, when I came back from Le Mans, I then, through a variety of reasons, had to take it to Paris literally 2 days later, and it was on that Paris run that the oil light came on, and that's when I had that first slightly heart-stopping moment, which was, okay, what is this? I'm not expecting this. But you keep that thing topped up, and you look after those engines, and they absolutely will look after you, right? So yes, so the drive to Nice thing, caveat: put a litre in the trunk, in the boot, right? Because you probably are going to consume most of it on the run down.
It's funny. I keep a bit of coolant in the back of mine as well, because they were always famously potential for overheating and stuff. But touch wood, mine has never gone through that type of issue. But look, I want to say a big thank you, Nige, for coming on the show and talking about 928. I know I've been badgering you to
yes,
on, certainly, because you've owned the car for a while now, and it's been great to talk with you through, your ownership the first year. And
for those out there that listen, that 928s and contact you or I to sort of have a more in-depth conversation about them, perhaps you're interested in buying one, right? Yeah. Last time I looked on Auto Trader, there were 7 for sale. So if you are in the market for one, you're not going to get the ideal choice. But in Europe, if you're happy with a left-hand drive, there are quite a few for sale, right? And if you're happy to go down the left hooker route, the market in Europe is pretty alive for these things. And I still do look, in part just to see where the value of my own vehicle is, but also to see, what else is out there, and you don't see a lot of GTSs come up, right? A lot of Series 4s. Yeah. And I think there's been a whole renaissance around the Series 1, actually. People are rediscovering that and are debating whether it really was, that original pure version is still the best one. It wasn't for me. I'm much like the S4s and the laters. But yeah, it's great to talk about these things. It's a real privilege to own them. I've said it to you. I've said it to anybody who will listen to me. I'm not selling that car. My son has already said it's being written to the will in his name. So now that I've got it, I intend to enjoy it. And if that's 4,000 or 5,000 miles a year doing what I do, then absolutely fantastic. But it's lovely to be able to share the stories. I don't really have any stories yet. We need to do the podcast, which is the stories, because that's when I think we get a chance to have a, because in front of me is a piece of fiberglass with photographs of every car that I've owned on it. And if I look at that board, there's a story with every single one, but I don't yet have a 928 story. So that's maybe for next time.
Well, maybe, but to say that you've owned it for a year and there's no sort of, crazy story shows Porsche engineering and, the trust you have in it. Like you say, you can hop in it for doing 1,000 miles without a hiccup, except for little
just keep the oil, right? That was the one. But yeah, so far so good, and it's just a joy. It's just a joy to be in. And as I said, it's a friendly car. It attracts attention in the right way, and I'm very happy to share to show people and to share that experience with people, right? Because I'm lucky. I know I am, but it's important to keep these things on the road. Right? Yeah, they represent a design era that doesn't exist anymore. They represent an engineering quality which perhaps does exist, but it was done in a different way for a different set of reasons. And if you compare a 30-year-old Jag XJS with a 30-year-old 928, you can see the difference. Yeah, right. You can see the difference. But yeah, it's been great to talk to you, Al. It always is. And if this sparks interest and we get to do some more, fabulous. Indeed. So thank you very much for having me. Excellent. Thanks, Nige. And just for everyone watching and listening, the next podcast will be along in the next few weeks. Thanks again.